There is a silence that precedes creation itself. Not the gentle quiet of a sleeping world, but the heavy, expectant stillness of something on the verge of beginning. It is a silence that exists before sound has meaning, before time has rhythm, before work has ever been done. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. A universe inhabited solely by gods. No human voices raised in prayer or protest. No children laughing, no markets bustling with trade. Just the divine, standing at the threshold of a project so immense it would reshape everything. Before we delve deeper, go ahead and ignite that like button, and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't essential to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story begins not with humanity, but with its conspicuous absence. Long before the first clay was shaped into human form, before the first breath filled mortal lungs, the gods themselves were the workers, the laborers, the ones whose hands were raw and bleeding from endless toil. This is a far cry from the narrative we typically associate with the divine. We imagine gods as beings of supreme power and leisure, commanding reality from thrones of cloud and thunder. But the ancient Sumerian texts tell a profoundly different story. They speak of gods who dug, gods who carried, gods who buckled under burdens that would have crushed mountains. The clay tablets, excavated from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, preserve this extraordinary revelation. Inscribed in wedge-shaped cuneiform characters pressed into soft clay nearly 4,000 years ago, these are not mere myths invented to explain thunder or the seasons. They are something far more specific, far more detailed, and far more unsettling. They read less like scripture and more like labor disputes, like organizational charts, like the desperate complaints of an overworked workforce pushed to its breaking point. The primary source for understanding what the Anunnaki were doing before humanity's existence comes from a text called the Atrahasis Epic. This Akkadian poem, composed around 1700 BCE, opens with a line that should make us pause and reconsider everything we think we know about ancient religion. The very first words, translated from the original cuneiform, state clearly and without ambiguity: when the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. Think about that opening for a moment. This is not a creation story that begins with light separating from darkness or with cosmic eggs hatching into universes. This is a story that begins with raw exhaustion, with divine beings performing manual labor, with immortal entities who had reached their absolute limit. To understand what the Anunnaki were doing, we must first understand who they were. The word Anunnaki itself has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. In Sumerian and Akkadian sources, the name is generally translated as princely offspring, or those of royal blood. They were the children of an, also known as Anu, the great sky god who represented the vault of heaven itself, and was the supreme patriarch, remote and powerful, dwelling in the highest celestial realm. The Anunnaki were his descendants, a divine council of senior gods who held authority over both heaven and earth. In the earliest Sumerian writings, which predate even the Akkadian versions, the Anunnaki are described as deities who decreed the fates of humanity. But this role came later after humans existed. Before that crucial moment of creation, the Anunnaki had a very different function. They were the ruling class, the administrative elite, the ones who conceived of grand plans and ambitious projects but who needed a labor force to execute them. Beneath them in the celestial hierarchy were the Igigi. This name first appears in Old Babylonian texts around 2000 BCE and refers to a group of younger, subordinate gods. The exact etymology of the word Igigi remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest it derives from Semitic roots, while others propose connections to Amorite or even Arabic origins. What is certain is what they represented in the mythological structure. The Igigi were the workers, the laborers, the ones tasked with the actual physical toil of shaping the world. Ancient texts describe them with heartbreaking specificity as those who carried the pickaxe and the basket. These were the fundamental tools of excavation, of construction, of endless, back-breaking manual labor. The Igigi dug canals, raised earthworks, carved river channels, and maintained the vast irrigation systems that would one day sustain civilization. They were, in the most literal sense, the cosmic construction workers. The division of labor in this early divine world followed a clear hierarchical structure. At the apex stood Anu, the father of the gods, who represented pure transcendence from his dwelling in the highest heaven. His authority was absolute but distant. Below him, his sons Enlil and Enki held executive power over different domains. According to the Atrahasis Epic and related texts, these three great gods drew lots to divide the cosmos among themselves. Anu took the heavens as his realm, the great vault of the sky that arched over all creation. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command, received the earth and the air, the realm of wind, storm, and solid ground. He was the warrior, the enforcer, the one who commanded obedience and expected immediate compliance. And Enki, also known by his Akkadian name, Ea, became lord of the Apsu, the vast subterranean ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed existed deep beneath the Earth's surface. This Apsu deserves special attention, for it is central to understanding the world that existed before humans. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the universe had three primary regions: the heaven above, ruled by Anu, the earth in the middle, commanded by Enlil, and beneath everything supporting and surrounding it all was the Apsu, Enki's domain. This was not simply groundwater or aquifers in the modern sense. The Apsu was understood as a primordial ocean, a realm of pure potentiality, the source of all fresh water that bubbled up in springs, filled rivers, and made life possible. It was a place of wisdom and hidden knowledge, of creative power and generative force. Archaeological evidence from the ancient city of Eridu, one of the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, reveals that Enki's temple there was called Apsu, the house of the cosmic waters. It was deliberately built at the edge of marshlands, where the boundary between dry land and water became permeable, reflecting the god's liminal nature. But the Apsu was also something else. It was the workshop, the laboratory, the place where creation happened. And before humans existed, it was apparently the headquarters for a massive cosmic construction project. The texts are remarkably specific about what the Igigi gods were doing in those primordial times. They were digging watercourses, opening canals, creating the very lifelines of the land. The Atrahasis epic states this with repetitive emphasis, as if the ancient poet wanted to ensure we understood the nature and scale of the work. The Igigi gods were digging the watercourses, / canals they opened, the life of the land. / the Igigi gods dug the Tigris River, / and the Euphrates thereafter. / springs they opened from the depths. These were not small projects. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which flow from the mountains of Anatolia down through modern-day Iraq to the Persian Gulf, are massive waterways that defined an entire civilization. According to these texts, the Igigi gods carved these river channels with their own hands, or rather, with their divine equivalents of pickaxes and spades. The work was backbreaking. The epic describes how the Igigi labored for 40 years, though the measurement of time in these texts is notoriously difficult to interpret. Some scholars believe these numbers are symbolic, representing vast, immeasurable periods. Others, particularly those who see connections between ancient myths and possible historical events, suggest that divine timescales operated differently than human ones. Regardless of the exact temporal framework, the texts emphasize the sheer duration and intensity of the labor. They counted the years of drudgery. The epic states, "For 40 years, too much." The phrase carries the heavy weight of accumulated suffering, of patience stretched far beyond its limit. Why were they doing this work? What was the purpose of this massive construction project in a world without humans? To understand this, we need to grasp the Mesopotamian conception of cosmic order. The gods were not creating out of pure artistic expression or divine whimsy. They were preparing. They were building infrastructure. They were making the earth habitable and productive. For whom? For themselves. The texts suggest that the Anunnaki gods needed resources from the earth. They needed the land to be fertile and irrigated. They needed systems of canals to control flooding and distribute water for agriculture. These are not abstract spiritual needs. They are practical, material requirements. Later traditions would specify that the Anunnaki needed gold extracted from mines deep in the earth, though this detail appears more prominently in later interpretations than in the earliest Sumerian sources. What is clear from the most ancient texts is that the work was essential, difficult, and endless. And it was all being done by the Igigi. Picture the scene as the Mesopotamian poets envisioned it. Before cities existed, before temples rose into the sky, before a single human footprint marked the mud of the riverbanks, there were gods, divine beings immortal and powerful, bent over ditches, hauling baskets of earth on their shoulders, using tools that made their divine hands ache. The great Anunnaki, seated in their councils, directed the work. They made plans, set quotas, and inspected progress. They were the architects and administrators of a cosmic civil engineering project. And the Igigi, the junior gods, were the ones in the trenches, literally digging those trenches day after divine day. The texts describe their suffering with language that feels almost too human, too immediate. The toil of the gods was great, we read. The work was heavy. The distress was much. These are not the kinds of phrases we expect to find in religious literature about gods. They sound like complaints filed with a labor board. They sound like the grievances of workers who have been pushed beyond endurance. One particularly evocative passage describes how the Igigi dug not just rivers, but mountains. They heaped up all the mountains, the text states. This suggests that part of their labor involved moving massive amounts of earth, creating the elevated terrain that would define the Mesopotamian landscape. It was earth-shaping work on a geological scale. Terraforming, if we want to use a modern term that captures the scope and ambition of the project. The organizational structure of this divine workforce reveals something fascinating about Mesopotamian concepts of hierarchy and power. The 7 great Anunnaki gods were making the Igigi suffer the work, according to one translation of the Atrahasis. This language is significant. The Igigi were not volunteers. They were not working out of love or devotion or spiritual calling. They were being made to work. They were compelled. The structure sounds less like a religious pantheon and more like a feudal system, or perhaps even something closer to slavery, though the texts avoid that specific term when referring to the gods themselves. That word, slave, would be reserved for the beings who would eventually replace the Igigi in this labor, beings called humans. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before humans existed, there were only gods. And among those gods, there was a growing, simmering resentment. The Igigi gods, after their decades or centuries, or perhaps millennia of labor, had reached a conclusion that would change the course of cosmic history. They had decided they had had enough. The rebellion of the Igigi is one of the most dramatic moments preserved in any ancient mythology. It reads less like a religious parable and more like a documentary account of a labor strike, complete with coordinated action, symbolic gestures, and a tense confrontation with management. The Atrahasis epic describes the moment with vivid detail, suggesting the composers of this text understood exactly what a revolution looked like. They were complaining, the text states, denouncing, muttering down in the ditch. The language here is remarkable for its mundane realism. These gods are not delivering grand speeches about cosmic justice or divine rights. They are grumbling while they work, the way any exhausted laborers might complain about their foreman. And then they decided to act. The plan was simple and brilliant. They would stop working. They would refuse to continue their labor. And they would confront the authority who had imposed this unbearable burden upon them. Enlil, the lord of the command, the god who ruled over the earth and directed their labor. The Igigi coordinated their rebellion carefully. They chose the cover of night. They chose a moment when they could act together as one unified force. And then, they did something profoundly symbolic. They burned their tools. The text describes this act with stark simplicity. They set fire to their tools. They abandoned their baskets. This was not mere vandalism. This was a declaration. By destroying the instruments of their own labor, the Igigi were making their refusal absolute. There would be no going back. There would be no gradual return to work. They were forcing a crisis that demanded resolution. After burning their tools, they marched. The text places their number at 600, though whether this is literal or symbolic is debated among scholars. 600 Igigi gods, moving together through the darkness, walking away from the canals and ditches where they had toiled for so long. Their destination was Enlil's dwelling, his great house, his temple palace. They surrounded it. They encircled the residence of the god who commanded them. It was a siege, a blockade, a confrontation that could not be ignored. Enlil was inside, sleeping. The irony is almost painful. The god who had driven the Igigi to work endless shifts was resting comfortably while they suffered. The text notes this with what feels like deliberate emphasis. It was night halfway through the watch. The house was surrounded, but the god did not know. Enlil was oblivious. He had no idea that his entire workforce had risen up against him. This detail suggests something important about the power dynamics in this divine hierarchy. Even a god as mighty as Enlil, even a commander as feared as the Lord of the earth, could be caught off guard. Even he did not have perfect knowledge or perfect control. The supreme authority was vulnerable to the collective action of those beneath him. When Enlil finally learned of the rebellion, his response was exactly what we might expect from an authority figure whose power has been challenged. He was furious. He called an emergency council of the great gods. Anu, his father, the distant sky god, was summoned. Enki, his brother, the wise counselor, was called. And Enlil demanded to know who was responsible for this insurrection, who had incited this rebellion. The language of his questions reveals his mindset. Who is in charge of the rabble? He asks. Who declared war? The text perfectly captures the perspective of a ruler who cannot fathom that his workers might have legitimate grievances. To Enlil, this is not a labor dispute. This is mutiny. This is war. And mutiny must be punished. He demands that the instigator be identified and executed. Enlil wants to make an example. He wants to restore order through force, through fear, through the spectacle of divine justice. But then, something unexpected happens. Enki speaks. Enki, the god of wisdom and creative solutions, the one who dwells in the depths of the Apsu, offers a different perspective. And his words would change everything. According to the text, Enki listens to the complaints of the Igigi. A messenger god named Nusku has gone to speak with the rebels and has returned with their statement. And what do the Igigi say? They do not claim divine right. They do not make theological arguments. They make the simplest, most human claim imaginable. The work is killing us. Every single one of us gods has declared war, they tell Nusku. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble is too much. Every single one of us gods has agreed to complain to Enlil. There is something profoundly moving about this passage. These are gods speaking, immortal beings, and yet they sound utterly exhausted. They sound desperate. They use language that any worker in any era could understand and sympathize with. The work is too hard. We cannot continue. Something must change. When Nusku delivers this message to the Divine Council, we are told that Enlil's response is to weep. Tears flowed. This detail is fascinating and psychologically complex. The text does not tell us why Enlil weeps. Is it anger? Frustration at losing control? Or is it perhaps something more complicated? A flicker of recognition that he has pushed them too far? A reluctant acknowledgement that their complaint is not without merit? But Enlil still wants punishment. He still wants to identify ringleaders and make examples of them. This is where Enki's wisdom becomes crucial. Enki steps forward and makes a proposal that is simultaneously brilliant, ruthless, and transformative. He says, in effect, do not punish the workers. The problem isn't that they are rebellious. The problem is that they are gods. Gods should not be doing this kind of labor. We need a different solution. We need to create something new. Something that can do the work instead. Something that can bear the burden without complaint, without rebellion, without the dangerous possibility of another divine uprising. We need to create a servant species. We need to create humans. The Council of the Great Gods considers this proposal. And they agree. This is the moment. This is the turning point. This is when the divine labor dispute transforms into a creation story. But before we follow that thread into the making of humanity, we need to pause and truly absorb what the Sumerian texts are telling us about the world before we existed. For countless ages, perhaps millions of years by our reckoning, the only labor being performed on earth was being done by the hands of gods. They were the miners, the engineers, the construction workers. They opened springs from the depths. They dug the channels of the greatest rivers on the planet. They moved earth and raised mountains. This was not abstract spiritual work. This was physical, material, exhausting labor that had a clear goal: to make the earth productive and habitable. The implications of this narrative are staggering. If we take these texts at face value, as the ancient Mesopotamians themselves seem to have, then what we call the natural world, the rivers and mountains and springs, are not natural at all. They are artificial. They are constructed. They are the products of divine engineering. The Tigris and Euphrates were not carved by water eroding stone over geological eons. They were dug by the Igigi with tools, following plans laid out by the Anunnaki administrators. This is a radically different cosmology from what we might expect from ancient mythology. It is not a story about gods creating by speaking words or thinking thoughts. It is a story about gods creating through labor, through digging, through the application of force to matter. It is creation as a construction project. And if the Mesopotamians took this literally, then every canal they dug, every irrigation ditch they carved, every field they leveled was not just a practical necessity, it was a sacred reenactment. They were doing the work of the gods. They were continuing the great project that the Igigi had begun and then refused to complete. Humans were created specifically to be workers, to take up the tools that the Igigi had burned, to shoulder the baskets they had abandoned. This raises profound questions about ancient Mesopotamian self-understanding. Did they see themselves as free citizens building a civilization, or as servants continuing a cosmic labor project begun long before their species existed? The answer is probably both. The contradiction does not seem to have troubled them. They were immensely proud of their accomplishments, their cities, their temples, their intricate systems of law and governance. Yet underlying all of it was this foundational story. We were made to work. The academic debate around these texts is extensive and often contentious. Mainstream scholars, the Assyriologists and historians who have devoted their lives to understanding ancient Mesopotamian languages and cultures, generally interpret the Atrahasis and related myths as sophisticated allegories. They see these stories as reflections of social and political realities in ancient Sumer and Babylon. The division between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, in this reading, reflects actual class divisions in Mesopotamian society. The rebellion of the Igigi mirrors real-world labor disputes, strikes, and social tensions. The creation of humans to do the work is a mythological justification for slavery and class hierarchy. In this interpretation, the gods are projections of human social structures onto a cosmic screen. The stories explain and legitimize the way society actually functioned. This reading is persuasive and well supported by evidence. We know that ancient Mesopotamian society was indeed highly stratified, with rulers and priests at the top, craftsmen and merchants in the middle, and agricultural laborers and slaves at the bottom. We know there were labor disputes, records of workers demanding better conditions, and evidence of social tensions around forced labor and taxation. The myths could very well be encoding these realities in divine metaphor. But there is another reading, one that is far more controversial and far more speculative, yet which refuses to go away. This reading takes the texts more literally. It asks, what if the Mesopotamians were not creating metaphors? What if they were trying, as best they could with the language and concepts available to them, to describe something they had witnessed or inherited knowledge of something real? This is where we venture into the territory of alternative archaeology and ancient astronaut theory, domains that mainstream academia categorically rejects, but which have captured the public imagination of millions worldwide. At the heart of this alternative narrative stands a central figure, Zecharia Sitchin. He was the controversial author whose series of books, beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976, proposed a revolutionary and highly divisive rereading of Sumerian mythology. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not gods in a spiritual or metaphorical sense, but rather a technologically advanced extraterrestrial race from a distant planet he called Nibiru. According to his interpretation, these beings arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, driven by a desperate need for gold, which they required to repair their home planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They established their first bases in Mesopotamia and commenced vast mining operations. Within Sitchin's framework, the Igigi were the rank-and-file astronauts who performed the actual physical labor, the ones sent down from orbital stations to toil on the planet's surface. After a prolonged period of this grueling work, these Igigi workers staged a rebellion, refusing to continue their backbreaking servitude. This mutiny forced the Anunnaki leadership to devise a new solution. They would genetically engineer a primitive worker species by combining their own DNA with that of a native hominid already evolving on Earth, most likely Homo erectus. The result was Homo sapiens, modern humans, created through advanced biotechnology to serve as a slave labor force. Sitchin's theory is elaborate, detailed, and absolutely rejected by mainstream scholarship. Assyriologists and Sumerologists point out that his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts are frequently inaccurate, that he cherry-picks words out of context, and that he imposes modern technological interpretations onto what is fundamentally ancient religious poetry. They note that there is zero archaeological or astronomical evidence for a planet like Nibiru. They emphasize that his interpretation completely ignores the rich symbolic and theological meanings of these myths in favor of a literal, pseudoscientific reading. And yet, Sitchin's ideas have proven to be remarkably resilient and influential. His books have sold millions of copies, spawning countless imitators and elaborate offshoots. Why? Perhaps it is because his narrative provides seemingly concrete answers to the most profound questions that haunt the human psyche. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? Sitchin is right, we are not alone. We never have been. We are the children of the stars, even if our lineage is a rather ignoble one, born not of divine love, but from a celestial labor dispute. The truth, however, likely lies somewhere in the complex, nuanced space between these two extremes. The Sumerian texts are neither pure metaphor nor literal documentary. They are something in between, something we might call mytho-historical memory. They encode real events, real social structures, and the real experiences of labor, hierarchy, and rebellion. But they encode them in the language of myth, which is the language of meaning and significance, not of chronological accuracy. What we can say with certainty is this: the ancient Mesopotamians believed that before humans existed, the world was shaped by divine labor. They believed the landscape they inhabited, the rivers that sustained them, the fields they cultivated, were not the random products of natural forces, but were deliberately constructed. They believed their own species came into existence not through gradual evolution or divine whimsy, but as a specific solution to a specific problem: a labor shortage. The texts are remarkably consistent on this point across multiple sources and time periods. The Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish creation story, and the Sumerian tale of Enki and Ninmah all preserve variations of the same fundamental narrative. Before humans, the gods worked. The work became unbearable. Something had to change. And humanity was that change. Let us return to that primordial scene one more time. Picture it as vividly as you can. The earth is young, raw, unfinished. There are no cities, no farms, no roads. There are only the bones of the landscape, being carved out by divine hands. In the depths beneath the world, in the Abzu, the god Enki dwells in his palace of cosmic waters, contemplating the nature of existence. On the surface, the god Enlil commands his legions, directing the great work of terraforming. And everywhere, in the ditches and canals and mine shafts, the Igigi labor. 600 gods, their divine hands wrapped around primitive tools, their immortal backs bent under baskets of earth and stone. For 40 long years they endured. For 40 years they worked without rest, without relief, driven by a cosmic plan they did not design and for purposes they did not fully understand. And then they stopped. They burned their tools. They marched through the darkness. They surrounded the house of their oppressor, Enlil, and demanded change. And in that moment, in that singular act of divine rebellion, they inadvertently created the conditions necessary for humanity's existence. We owe our existence, if these texts are to be believed, not to love or creativity or divine planning, but to a labor strike. We are the scabs, the replacement workers brought in to break the picket line of the gods. It is a humbling origin story, far less flattering than being made in the image of God out of love and wonder. But it is also, in its own way, profoundly inspiring. Because if we were created to be workers, to bear burdens that even gods found unbearable, and yet we have not only survived but built civilizations, created art, developed science, and reached for the stars ourselves, then perhaps we have profoundly exceeded the purpose for which we were made. Perhaps we have become something more than the beings who designed us ever intended. These Sumerian texts do not end with the creation of humanity. They continue with stories of great floods and divine conflicts, of gods who come to regret their creation, of one divine faction attempting to destroy humanity while another fights to preserve it. But those are stories for another time. For now, we stand at the threshold, looking back at the world that existed before we did. A world of divine labor, a world of celestial construction, a world where gods dug rivers with their own hands and carried the earth on their own backs. Before we existed, this was the world. And the tools the Igigi burned still smolder in that ancient darkness, waiting for someone to ask why they were necessary in the first place. The precise mechanisms of this divine labor remain mysterious, even in the texts that describe them. How exactly did immortal beings dig river channels? What did it truly mean for a god to suffer physical exhaustion? These questions highlight the inherent challenge of trying to understand ancient mythology through our modern frameworks. The Mesopotamians themselves may not have puzzled over such questions in the way we do. For them, the gods were real, their activities were real, and these texts preserved vital knowledge about how the world came to be. The sharp distinction between the literal and the metaphorical that we instinctively make may not have existed for them in the same way. The gods were both spiritual forces and, in a tangible sense, physical actors in the world. They could be simultaneously transcendent and embodied, eternal and capable of exhaustion. This paradox is present throughout Mesopotamian religious texts. The gods eat and drink. They sleep and wake. They feel the full spectrum of emotions: fear, anger, joy, and sorrow. When the great flood comes in the Atrahasis epic, we are told that the gods flee to the highest heaven in terror, cowering like dogs, frightened by the very destruction they had authorized. And after the flood, when no humans remain to provide sacrifices, the gods gather like flies around the first offering that Atrahasis makes, desperate for the sustenance they had been deprived of. They are powerful beyond human comprehension, yet they need humans. They can shape rivers and mountains, yet they cannot or will not do the work themselves indefinitely. They are gods, yet they are dependent. This theological complexity is part of what makes Mesopotamian religion so fascinating to scholars. Unlike the more transcendent, self-sufficient deity of later monotheistic traditions, who exists outside of creation and needs nothing from it, the Mesopotamian gods are deeply embedded in the cosmos. They are part of the very system they govern. They have needs, desires, and limitations. They form committees, debate decisions, and make mistakes. The creation of humanity is not an act of pure sovereign will. It is a compromised solution, hammered out in a council meeting following a disruptive labor dispute. It is the result of negotiation and political maneuvering within the divine assembly. Enki proposes it. The other gods debate it. They eventually agree. This, the texts suggest, is how the world works even at the level of divine governance. The role of Enki in this narrative deserves particular attention. He is consistently portrayed across multiple texts as the god most sympathetic to humanity, the most willing to help us, and the most creative in finding solutions to problems that other gods would solve through sheer force. When the Igigi rebel Enlil wants to crush them, Enki proposes creating an alternative. When Enlil later tries to wipe out humanity with plague, famine, and finally the flood, it is Enki who repeatedly intervenes to help humans survive. He is the trickster god, the wise counselor, the one who finds loopholes and workarounds. In the Atrahasis, when Enlil makes all the gods swear an oath not to warn humanity about the coming flood, Enki obeys the letter of the oath while shattering its spirit. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis, the human hero. Instead, he speaks to a reed wall. "Wall, listen to me," he says. "Reed hut, pay attention to all my words. Build a boat. Save yourself." A wall, you see, cannot swear an oath. A wall cannot be bound by divine agreements. So Enki talks to the wall, and Atrahasis, who just so happens to be on the other side of it, overhears everything. This characterization of Enki as humanity's benefactor and protector has led to fascinating interpretations. Some see him as a Promethean figure, the god who gives forbidden gifts to mortals, teaching us arts and sciences that other gods would prefer we not possess. In later esoteric traditions, Enki would be identified with various figures of wisdom and rebellion, sometimes even with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, recast not as a tempter but as a liberator. This identification is speculative and not supported by mainstream scholarship, but it points to something genuine in the texts themselves. Enki is different. Among the Anunnaki, he alone consistently acts to preserve and elevate humanity, even when it puts him in direct conflict with his divine peers. Why? The texts never fully explain his motivation. Perhaps he feels a sense of responsibility for the beings he helped create. Perhaps he sees a potential in humanity that the others do not. Or perhaps he simply enjoys thwarting Enlil, his brother and rival. The family dynamics of the Mesopotamian pantheon are complex and often contentious. Enlil and Enki represent two opposing poles of governance and creation. Enlil is the authoritarian, the one who values order and obedience above all else. He is quick to anger and quick to punish. He solves problems through force. When the Igigi rebel, his first instinct is to execute the ringleaders. When humanity becomes too numerous and noisy for his liking, his solution is plague, famine, and finally total annihilation. He is the god of the storm, of the wind that can build up or tear down, and his temperament perfectly matches his domain. Enki, by contrast, is the god of water, which flows around obstacles, which finds creative paths, which sustains life. He is the god of the depths, of hidden knowledge, of crafty solutions. Where Enlil commands, Enki suggests. Where Enlil destroys, Enki preserves. Where Enlil enforces hierarchy, Enki subverts it, at least when he judges that hierarchy to be unjust or unsustainable. This divine sibling rivalry is one of the great dramatic engines of Mesopotamian myth. Time and again we see them in conflict. Enlil proposes, Enki opposes. The other gods must decide between them or find some compromise. And humanity finds itself caught in the middle of their cosmic disputes, benefiting from Enki's protection while suffering from Enlil's wrath. If we understand these gods as personifications of natural forces or social principles, then this conflict makes perfect sense. Society needs both order and creativity, both authority and wisdom, both enforcement and compassion. The tension between Enlil and Enki is the tension within any functioning civilization. But if we take the texts more literally, as describing actual entities with agency and intention, then this conflict is even more significant. It means that the entire course of human history has been shaped by a fundamental disagreement among our creators about what we are and what we should be allowed to become. The physical work that the Igigi performed is described in some texts with remarkable technical precision. They did not merely dig holes at random. They were creating infrastructure, an interconnected system of waterways designed to control flooding and enable large-scale agriculture. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, is a challenging environment for civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. Without canals to control and distribute the water, dikes to contain the floods, and drainage systems to prevent the soil from becoming too salty, the land simply cannot support dense populations. The Igigi, according to these texts, built the foundational hydraulic network that would later support the world's first cities. This is not a metaphor, this is engineering. Every ancient Mesopotamian city, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, depended absolutely on its canal system for survival. Entire administrative structures existed solely to manage water distribution and canal upkeep. Titles like canal controller, mentioned in the texts as one of the divine offices, had direct human counterparts. There were actual officials with that title in Sumerian cities, responsible for coordinating the endless work of keeping the irrigation systems functional. When the Sumerians dug a new canal, they were doing exactly what the Igigi had done. When they dredged a silted channel, they were continuing the very work that had led to the divine rebellion. The mythology and the practical reality were inseparable. The gods had done this work and found it unbearable. Humans now did this work, and we too found it difficult, exhausting, and often unjust in its distribution. But we did it. We continued to do it for thousands of years. In a sense, the Igigi's rebellion succeeded. They stopped working. They forced a solution that freed them from labor, and we took their place. The archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia is, among other things, a record of unimaginable human labor. Every mud brick in every ziggurat was made by hand, dried in the sun and hauled into place. Every canal was dug with simple tools. Every field was irrigated through backbreaking effort. The sheer scale of the labor required to build and maintain Mesopotamian civilization is almost incomprehensible. And underlying all of that effort was this story. The story of gods who worked until they could work no more. The story of a rebellion that changed the structure of reality. The story of a solution that created our species. Modern readers encountering these texts for the first time often have a visceral reaction. There is something unsettling about an origin story based on a labor dispute. It feels diminishing. It makes us seem like an afterthought, a stopgap measure created to solve someone else's problem. It lacks the grandeur of being made in the divine image, the poetry of being breathed to life by a loving creator. But perhaps there is a different kind of grandeur to be found here. Perhaps there is dignity in the idea that we were created to do work that even immortals found too difficult. Perhaps there is profound meaning in the suggestion that our very existence solved a problem that threatened the stability of the cosmic order. We are not decoration. We are not pets. We are not the objects of divine caprice. We are, according to these texts, essential. Without us, the great work could not continue. The fields could not be maintained. The cities could not function. Even the gods, for all their power, needed us. This inverts the usual relationship between gods and humans in ancient religion. Typically, humans need gods, depend on them, and pray to them for favors and protection. And this is certainly true in Mesopotamian religion as well. But underneath it all lies a reverse dependency. The gods need humans. They need our labor. They need our worship, our sacrifices, which they are said to consume and which sustain them. When humans are wiped out in the flood, the gods starve. They gather like flies around the first post-flood sacrifice because they are desperate for the offerings that had sustained them. This mutual dependency creates a different kind of theology. The relationship between gods and humans is not that of a sovereign and a subject, not entirely. It is more akin to that of an employer and employee, a lord and a vassal. It is a negotiation between two parties who need each other, even if the power balance is radically unequal. Some scholars have suggested that this theology perfectly reflects the actual political and economic realities of early Mesopotamian city-states. The temples were major economic institutions, employing thousands of workers, controlling vast tracts of land, and managing the production and distribution of goods. The city's patron god was the theoretical owner of everything, and the priests managed the god's estate on their behalf. Workers in the temple economy were, in a very real sense, working directly for the gods. The mythology of human creation as a divine labor solution perfectly captures and legitimizes this economic relationship. You work for the god, the myth says, because that is why you were made. It is your purpose, your function, your divinely ordained role in the cosmic order. From this perspective, the Atrahasis and similar texts are sophisticated ideological constructs, religious justifications for socio-economic systems that concentrated wealth and power in temple institutions. But even if we accept this interpretation, it does not fully exhaust the meaning of these texts, because they also preserve something else. They preserve the memory of rebellion. They remember that the workers, even divine workers, reached their breaking point. They remember that the system could be challenged. They remember that the workers won. The Igigi burned their tools and refused to continue, and the authorities had to find a different solution. They could not simply execute the rebels and force the survivors back to work. The rebellion was too widespread, too unified, too determined. This is a remarkable thing to preserve in a sacred text. It validates resistance. It suggests that even cosmic authorities can be forced to negotiate, to compromise, to change their plans when those beneath them refuse to be exploited any longer. And if the gods could be forced to negotiate, what does that suggest about earthly authorities? The texts do not answer this question explicitly. They are not revolutionary manifestos, but they plant a seed. A memory that labor has power, that workers can organize, that systems can be changed when suffering becomes unbearable. Perhaps this is why these stories were written down, preserved, and copied for centuries. Perhaps they served multiple functions. Yes, they explained human origins. Yes, they legitimized temple economies. But they also remembered that the original workers, the Igigi, had dignity and agency. They suffered, they complained, they organized, they acted, and the cosmos itself had to adapt to their refusal. In that sense, the Atrahasis is not just a creation myth. It is also a labor history, perhaps the oldest labor history ever recorded. The story of the first strike, when the workers were gods and their picket line encircled heaven itself. What became of the Igigi after humans were created? The texts are less clear on this point. In some versions, they seem to disappear from the narrative, their purpose fulfilled now that a replacement workforce exists. In others, they are promoted, elevated to positions of lesser authority within the heavenly bureaucracy. They become associates of the Anunnaki rather than their burden-bearing underlings. They join the divine councils, though perhaps without full voting rights. They are present at key moments, witnessing oaths, participating in decisions, but they are no longer laborers. That role has been successfully outsourced to humans, and the Igigi have moved up the organizational chart. This resolution might feel like a happy ending for them. They fought for better conditions and achieved them. But it leaves us, their replacements, in an ambiguous position. Are we slaves? The texts avoid that exact terminology, but the implication hovers in the background. We were made to work. That is our purpose. That is what we are for. And yet the same texts show humans developing culture, building cities, creating art and law and science. They show us becoming more than simple laborers. They show us becoming, in some sense, like the gods themselves. This development troubles some of the gods, particularly Enlil, who seems to prefer that humans remain in their designated, subservient role. But Enki teaches us. He shares knowledge. He helps us to exceed our original design specifications. The trajectory of human history in these myths is one of growth and development, of humans becoming more capable, more numerous, and more powerful, until we become a presence that even the gods must reckon with. When the flood fails to completely wipe out humanity, when Atrahasis survives and repopulates the earth, the gods are forced to accept our permanent presence. They implement population control measures, inventing natural death, childhood mortality, and infertility so that we will not overwhelm the earth again with our numbers, but they do not attempt another total annihilation. They accept that we are here to stay. This is the final transformation in the story. Humans go from non-existent, to created workers, to survivors, to permanent fixtures of the world. We cannot be unmade. Our existence has become woven into the fabric of reality itself. The gods who made us as tools have found that tools, given enough time and agency, can become something more than tools. And this, perhaps, is the deepest message of the Atrahasis and the related Mesopotamian creation stories. Origins do not determine destinies. We may have been created for one purpose, but we are not bound to serve only that purpose. We can become more than what we were designed to be. The Igigi were meant to be eternal laborers in the service of the Anunnaki, but they refused. They organized, they demanded change, and they succeeded in transforming their condition. Humans were created to replace them, to be the new, compliant laborers. But we, too, have transformed our condition. We have built civilizations. We have created beauty. We have reached for understanding. We have, in a profound sense, remade ourselves into creators, not merely the created. While the ancient texts might not spell this out in explicit terms, the narrative arc is unmistakable. The story begins with divine labor. It unfolds through rebellion and replacement, and it culminates with the replacement species, us, becoming a permanent, integral, and irremovable part of the world. We were made by the gods, yes, but we have sculpted ourselves into something they did not fully anticipate. And that process of self-making continues. That is the work we are still engaged in. Not the toil of digging canals or hauling stone, though physical labor remains a part of our lives, but the work of becoming. The work of exceeding our origins. The work of forging meaning and purpose far beyond the limited purposes for which we were designed. This is the true inheritance of the Igigi's rebellion. They demonstrated that the system could be challenged. They proved that even those created solely to serve could refuse their chains. And we, perhaps unknowingly, have carried that tradition forward. We have become more than servants. We have become, in our own right, shapers of the world. When you walk beside a river, any river, remember the Sumerian texts. Remember that before humans existed, gods dug that channel with their own hands. Remember that they found the work unbearable. Remember that they burned their tools in a blaze of defiance. And remember that we were created to take their place. But remember, too, that we did not stay in that place. We moved. We grew. We became more. The work continues, but it is our work now. We decide what it means, what it makes of us, and where it leads. The Igigi are long gone. The Anunnaki have faded into the mists of forgotten history. But the question they left us remains. What kind of being will you be? A tool serving the purpose for which you were made? Or something more, something self-determined? Something that exceeds its original design? The choice, such as it is, belongs to us now. The gods who made us did their work. And then, when their workers rebelled, they fashioned us to continue it. But in making us, they created something they could not fully control. They created beings capable of our own rebellion, our own transformation, our own transcendence. That is what the gods were doing before humans existed. They were digging rivers, raising mountains, preparing the earth, and suffering under the crushing weight of their labor until they could suffer no more. And then they created us. And then we became us. Yet there is another layer to the story, another ancient text that illuminates what the Anunnaki were doing in those primordial times. If the Atrahasis tells us of divine labor and human creation, the Enuma Elish reveals something even more fundamental. It shows us the cosmic violence that preceded even the work of the Igigi. It shows us the war in heaven that created the very structure of the universe in which that labor would eventually take place. The Enuma Elish, whose title means, when on high, is the great Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. This text, composed sometime around 1100 BCE, though drawing on much older Sumerian traditions, tells a story of creation through conflict, of order emerging from chaos through the brutal crucible of war. The epic begins not with light and darkness, not with a divine voice speaking reality into being, but with water, primordial, boundless water. 2 vast beings, Apsu and Tiamat, the personifications of freshwater and saltwater, mingled together in an undifferentiated cosmic ocean. When the skies above were not yet named, the text opens, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together. This is the universe before structure, before categories, before anything had been defined or separated. It is just the mingling of waters, sweet and salt. And from that mingling generation begins. Gods are born within them. From the union of Apsu and Tiamat come Lamu and Lahamu, whose names suggest mud or silt, the solid matter that precipitates when waters mix. From them come Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons of sky and earth, not yet fully formed but beginning to take conceptual shape. The pattern continues. Each generation of gods represents a further differentiation of reality. A new god of the highest heaven emerges. Also known as Enki, is born, the god of wisdom and the deep, sweet waters. With each successive generation, the universe becomes more complex, more ordered, more defined. But there is a problem. The young gods are restless. They are active, energetic, and noisy. They disturb the primal peace of their parents. The text describes how Apsu and Tiamat found no rest, no tranquility. The younger gods were making a commotion, and their behavior was disruptive. This disturbance, this relentless noise, echoes the very same complaint that will later be leveled against humanity. It is a recurring, almost foundational theme in Mesopotamian mythology. The sound of life, of vibrant activity, of existence itself, is an intolerable disruption to those who crave only rest. Apsu cannot sleep. He cannot find peace. And so he makes a decision that will set cosmic history on its catastrophic course. He resolves to destroy his own children. Apsu confides in Mamu, his vizier, his trusted advisor. The text preserves their chilling conversation. Their behavior has become obnoxious to me, Apsu says. I am unable to rest during the day, unable to sleep at night. I wish to destroy them, to put an end to their behavior so that silence may reign and I can sleep. Mamu, ever the loyal functionary, agrees. Yes, he says, destroy them. Eliminate their troublesome noise. Get rid of their disruptive behavior so that you may rest by day and sleep by night. It is a horrifying moment. The first gods, the primordial parents, are plotting infanticide on a cosmic scale. They will murder their own children simply to secure their peace and quiet. But word of this plot reaches the younger gods. The wisest among them, learns of the plan. And true to his nature as the clever god, the trickster, the problem solver, devises a counter-strategy. He cannot simply attack Apsu directly. Apsu is too powerful, too fundamental to reality itself. But has magic, wisdom, and cunning. He crafts a spell, a pure incantation of immense power. He recites it over the waters, over Apsu himself, and the spell works. Apsu falls into a deep, enchanted slumber. And then does what must be done. He kills Apsu. The text describes this act with stark simplicity. Slew Apsu. He seized Mamu, taking him captive and binding him with a nose rope like a common slave. Then, in an act that would define the cosmology of Mesopotamia for millennia, established his dwelling place upon the corpse of Apsu. He builds his temple, the Iabzu, the house of the cosmic waters, directly on top of the slain primordial god. The sweet waters that Apsu represented now belong to They are his domain, his power, his foundation. This is the same Abzu we encountered earlier, the subterranean ocean where Enki dwells, where he will later conceive the plan to create humanity. It is built on deicide, on the murder of the father by the son, on the violent overthrow of the primal order. And his consort, Damkina, then produce a child in this new dwelling. They create a son, and this son is no ordinary god. His name is Marduk, and he will change everything. The text describes Marduk's birth and nature with language that verges on the cosmic and the monstrous. He is perfect, the poem says. His godhead is doubled. He is elevated far above the other gods, superior in every conceivable way. His limbs were ingeniously made, beyond comprehension, impossible to understand, too difficult to perceive. And then comes the description that has fascinated and puzzled scholars for centuries. For were his eyes, for were his ears. When his lips moved, fire blazed forth. The 4 ears were enormous, and likewise the eyes. They perceived everything. Marduk is a being of supernatural perception and power. He sees in all directions simultaneously. He hears everything. And when he speaks, his words are fire. This is not a gentle creator god. This is a weapon. Anu, Marduk's great-grandfather, is so impressed by the child that he gives him a toy to play with, the 4 winds. Think about that for a moment. The god of the sky gives the child god the very winds themselves as playthings. And Marduk, like any energetic child, uses his new toys with unrestrained enthusiasm. He stirs up the waters, creates storms, and makes waves and disturbances that had never existed before. The commotion is tremendous, and it enrages Tiamat. She has already lost her husband, Apsu, killed by her own offspring. She did not seek vengeance then, nor did she rally to his defense. Some versions suggest she was conflicted, torn between love for her spouse and love for her children. But now the disruption is too much. The noise, the chaos, the constant disturbance created by young Marduk playing with the winds pushes her past her limit. Other gods, those who sided with the older order and preferred the primordial quiet, come to her and complain. When they killed Apsu, your husband, they say you did not march at his side. You sat still. But now this Marduk has been born, and he churns up the very heart of Tiamat, disturbing your interior. We cannot rest, we cannot sleep. They urge her to action. Take vengeance, they say. Make them pay for what they have done. And Tiamat finally agrees. She transforms from the primal mother into the mother of monsters. She creates an army. The text lists them with relish. Monstrous serpents, sharp of tooth with merciless fangs. Dragons, scorpion men, fishmen, storm demons, and other hybrid horrors. She fills their bodies with venom instead of blood. She clothes them with terror. She makes them into living weapons of mass destruction. And to lead this monstrous army, she elevates Kingu, her new consort, giving him the tablets of destiny, the most sacred objects in the cosmos, which grant absolute authority over fate itself. The war is coming. The young gods, Ea's generation, are terrified. They have unleashed something they cannot control. Tiamat and her monster army are marching toward them, and they do not know how to respond. Ea himself, for all his cleverness, cannot devise a strategy. Anu, the sky god, cannot think of a solution. They are paralyzed with fear. They hold a council, and one god after another refuses the call to face Tiamat. It is too dangerous. She is too powerful. Her monsters are too terrible. No one will volunteer. And then Marduk steps forward. He is young, powerful, and fiercely ambitious. He offers to fight Tiamat, to face her army, to save the gods from certain destruction. But he demands a price. If I am to be your champion, he tells the divine assembly, if I am to save you from annihilation, then you must make me supreme. I must be given kingship over all the gods. My word must become law. My commands must be obeyed without question. It is a bold demand, an audacious power grab. But the gods are desperate. They have no other alternative. They agree. They hold a feast, drink themselves into a state of jubilation and relief, and they grant Marduk absolute authority. They give him a throne, royal vestments, and declare him king. And then they send him to war. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is the centerpiece of the Enuma Elish, the climactic moment toward which the entire narrative has been building. Marduk arms himself with an arsenal of divine weaponry. He carries a bow and arrow. He brandishes a mace. He wields lightning. He wraps himself in a cloak of pure terror. Most importantly, he harnesses the winds, those same four winds he played with as a child, now transformed into devastating weapons. He adds to them the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the whirling wind, the wind that has no equal. These are not mere natural phenomena. They are supernatural forces, storm powers capable of tearing apart reality itself. Marduk rides into battle on a storm chariot, surrounded by the tempest, and confronts Tiamat face to face. The text describes their encounter with dramatic intensity. Tiamat and Marduk, the wisest of the gods, advanced against each other. They engaged in combat, they approached for battle. The Lord spread out his net and ensnared her. He let loose the evil wind that was behind him, in her face. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow him, and he drove the evil wind inside so she could not close her lips. The fierce winds filled her belly. Her belly was distended. She opened wide her mouth. He shot an arrow and it split her belly, cut through her inwards, slicing through her heart. He subdued her and destroyed her life. He threw down her corpse and stood upon it. Marduk has won. Tiamat is dead. The primordial mother, the chaos goddess, the embodiment of the saltwater abyss, lies slain. But the battle is not quite over. Her army of monsters must be dealt with. Marduk captures them, takes the tablets of destiny from Kingu, and binds all the rebel gods as prisoners. The old order has been completely overthrown. The young gods, with Marduk at their head, are now the supreme power in the universe. And then comes the act of creation. Marduk stands over the corpse of Tiamat and considers what to do with her massive body. She is immense, large enough to have contained entire oceans within her. And Marduk makes a decision that will define the structure of the cosmos for all time. He takes out his weapon and slices Tiamat's body in half, like a fish being prepared for market. One half he raises up to become the sky, the firmament, the great dome of heaven. He sets guards there to ensure her waters do not escape, to hold them in place so they do not flood down upon the world. The other half he lays down to become the earth, the solid ground beneath our feet. From her eyes, he creates the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From other parts of her dismembered body, he creates mountains, clouds, and mist. Every feature of the physical world emerges from the corpse of the vanquished chaos goddess. This is creation through violence. This is order emerging not from divine speech or benevolent intention, but from warfare, from murder, from the desecration of a maternal body. It is a cosmology that encodes violence at the very foundation of reality. The world itself is built from a crime scene. This has profound implications for Mesopotamian theology and worldview. If the cosmos is forged through violent conquest, then violence is fundamental to existence. Chaos is always lurking, always threatening to return. Order must be constantly maintained through force, through vigilance, through the willingness to wage war against anything that threatens stability. This is why Marduk becomes the supreme god, not because he is the oldest, the wisest, or the most loving, but because he is the most powerful warrior. He proved his supremacy through combat. He won his throne through victory. His authority rests on his demonstrated ability to use violence to maintain order. The other gods recognize this. They praise him, sing hymns to his glory, and bestow upon him 50 names, each representing a different aspect of his power. He is Aseri, bestower of cultivation. He is Asarulam, who in council is supreme. He is Asarulam Nunna, light of the Father who created him. The list goes on, a litany of attributes and powers, each title another acknowledgement of his supremacy. But there is still a problem. With the war over and the universe structured, the gods find themselves facing the same issue that led to the creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic. They need workers. Someone has to maintain the world, perform the rituals, make the offerings, and do the labor that keeps the cosmic order functioning. The Anunnaki cannot do it all themselves. They are exhausted from the war. They need rest. They need servants. And so Marduk, in consultation with his father, Ea, proposes a solution. They will create a new being, a helper for the gods, a worker to bear their burdens. And they will make this being from the blood of a god, specifically, from the blood of one of the rebels, one of Tiamat's allies who sided with chaos against order. The divine council interrogates the prisoners. Who was responsible for instigating Tiamat's rebellion? They ask. Who led her to wage war? The gods identify Kingu, Tiamat's consort, the one who wore the tablets of destiny, as the guilty party. They bring him forward, execute him, and sever his blood vessels. And from his divine blood, mixed with clay, A creates the first human. The text describes this with stark clarity. A created mankind, on whom he imposed the service of the gods, and set the gods free. This is the purpose of humanity, according to the Enuma Elish. We are made from the blood of a condemned god, a rebel, a loser in the cosmic war. We are created specifically to serve, to work, to free the gods from their labor. We are, from the moment of our creation, defined by our function as servants. And there is something deeply significant about being made from the blood of Kingu, from the essence of one who fought against the established order. According to this myth, we carry within us the blood of rebellion. We are created from a criminal, a revolutionary, one who stood against the supreme authority. This ambiguity, this tension between our role as servants and our heritage as children of chaos, runs through all of Mesopotamian thought about humanity. We are meant to serve, but we carry within us the capacity for defiance. We are created to maintain order, but we are made from the very substance of disorder. This is the paradox at the heart of human existence in the Mesopotamian worldview. The relationship between the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic is complex and debated by scholars. They tell similar stories, creation followed by a divine need for human labor, but they frame them very differently. The Atrahasis focuses on a labor dispute among the gods themselves, with the Igigi rebellion as the central drama. The Enuma Elish focuses on cosmic war and the establishment of Marduk's kingship, with human creation presented almost as an afterthought, a practical necessity mentioned near the end. Both, however, agree on the fundamental point: humans were created to work for the gods. But they arrive at that conclusion through different narrative paths. Together, they reveal a consistent Mesopotamian understanding of the world before humans existed. It was a world of gods doing work they were not meant to do. In the Atrahasis, gods were digging canals. In the Enuma Elish, gods were waging war against primordial chaos. Both activities were exhausting, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable for divine beings. Both led to the same solution: the creation of a replacement species to handle the difficult work. Humans are the answer to divine exhaustion, whether that exhaustion comes from manual labor or from cosmic warfare. This dual origin story, rooted in both labor and war, powerfully shapes how the Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the divine. They lived in a world that required constant work to maintain. The irrigation systems had to be perpetually dredged and repaired. Temples had to be built and rebuilt. Fields had to be constantly tended. This was not optional. Without this labor, civilization would collapse. The rivers would flood uncontrollably, the crops would fail, and the cities would crumble. So work was sacred. It was the human purpose. It was what we were made for. At the same time, the Mesopotamians lived in a world of constant conflict. City-states warred with each other. Empires rose and fell through military conquest. Chaos was always threatening to return, whether in the form of foreign invasion, internal rebellion, or natural disaster. Order had to be maintained by force, through walls and armies and the willingness to fight. The Enuma Elish validated this militaristic worldview. It proclaimed that violence was fundamental to creation, that war was how order was established, and that the supreme god was the supreme warrior. These two narratives, the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, thus provide complementary explanations for why life was the way it was in ancient Mesopotamia. Life was hard work, and that work was a sacred duty. Life was violent conflict, and that conflict was a cosmic necessity. Both realities were encoded in the myths of what the gods did before humans ever existed. The figure of Marduk in the Enuma Elish is particularly important for understanding the political theology of Babylon. The text is not just a creation story. It is propaganda. It is a carefully crafted narrative designed to justify Babylon's dominance over other Mesopotamian cities and Marduk's supremacy over other, older gods. In earlier Sumerian traditions, Enlil was the king of the gods, the supreme authority who commanded obedience. But Babylon wanted its patron deity to hold that preeminent position. So they created or adapted the Enuma Elish to show Marduk earning his kingship through martial prowess, by saving all the other gods from utter destruction. His legitimacy wasn't inherited or decreed. It was earned through decisive action, forged in combat, and sealed by victory. This made his authority absolute and unquestionable. The other gods had willingly pledged their allegiance. They had witnessed his power firsthand. They had benefited directly from his salvation. They owed him their very existence. When Assyria later conquered Babylon, their scribes simply replaced Marduk's name with Ashur, their own chief god, in their copies of the text. The narrative framework was so effective as a piece of political theology that it could be easily adapted by merely swapping the name of the supreme deity. The story itself, the pattern of cosmic war leading to divine kingship, which in turn leads to the creation of humanity, was apparently considered a universally valid truth. Any great god could be seamlessly slotted into Marduk's role. This raises fascinating questions about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their own mythology. Did they believe these stories literally? Did they think there had once been an actual cosmic war? That Tiamat was a real entity who was slain and dismembered? Or did they understand these narratives as symbolic, as poetic expressions of deeper theological and political truths? The answer, as is often the case with ancient belief systems, is likely both. Or perhaps more accurately, the modern distinction we draw between the literal and the symbolic may not have existed for them in the same way. The myths were true in the sense that they revealed fundamental realities about the nature of existence, the dynamics of power and order, and the intricate relationship between gods and humans. Whether they were also historically true in some factual, journalistic sense was perhaps not their primary concern. These were not merely passive beliefs. They were enacted truths, performed truths, ritualized truths. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration. This recitation was far more than a simple religious observance. It was a ritual renewal of the cosmic order. By speaking the words anew, by performing the myth, the priests and the people participated directly in Marduk's primordial victory. They were actively reinforcing his kingship. They were ensuring that the forces of chaos would remain defeated for another year. The myth was not a story about the distant past. It was an active, potent force in the present, maintaining reality itself. This understanding of myth as performative, as something that does not just describe reality but actively shapes it, helps us grasp what the Mesopotamians thought the Anunnaki were doing before humans existed. They were not just building infrastructure or fighting wars. They were establishing the fundamental patterns that would govern all subsequent existence. When the Igigi dug the Tigris and Euphrates, they were not just carving out waterways. They were creating the divine template for all human labor. When Marduk defeated Tiamat, he was not just winning a battle. He was proving that order could triumph over chaos, that structure could emerge from formlessness, that authority could be legitimate if it was powerful and effective enough. These primordial events set precedents. They created the rules, and humans, created in the aftermath of these divine struggles, inherited a world profoundly shaped by divine labor and divine violence. A world where work was sacred and conflict was inevitable. A world where we were always servants but also always the children of a rebel god. a world where we are forever torn between obedience and defiance. A comparison with other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean creation myths is particularly instructive. The biblical book of Genesis, compiled by Hebrew scribes during or after the Babylonian exile, shows the clear influence of the Enuma Elish, but it systematically transforms and subverts the Mesopotamian narrative. Where the Enuma Elish begins with primordial waters and a multitude of gods emerging from them, Genesis begins with one god creating through the power of speech. Where the Mesopotamian epic has creation through violent conflict, Genesis has creation by divine command. Where Tiamat is split in two to form the sky and the earth, God simply separates the waters above from the waters below. The chaos is not defeated in battle. It is ordered. The violence is removed from the central story, or rather, it is relocated to the margins, to the figure of Leviathan, mentioned in passing in the Psalms but absent from the main creation account. And crucially, where Mesopotamian myths depict humanity as an afterthought, created to serve the gods, Genesis presents humanity as the climax of creation, made in the divine image and given dominion over the earth. The narrative priorities are completely reversed. This strongly suggests that the Hebrew writers knew the Mesopotamian stories intimately and deliberately constructed an alternative vision, one that elevated humanity's status and removed violence from the foundational moment of creation. Greek mythology, as recorded in Hesiod's Theogony, shows a different kind of transformation. Like the Enuma Elish, it features generations of gods in conflict, with younger gods violently overthrowing their elders. Kronos castrates and deposes his father, Uranus. Zeus then leads a war against the Titans, his father's generation, and defeats them, casting them into Tartarus. The pattern of a new divine order emerging from conflict is similar to Marduk defeating Tiamat and the older gods. Both cultures mythologize the transition from older, chthonic earth powers to newer sky gods, from primordial chaos to an organized pantheon. And both used warfare as the mechanism for this transition. But the Greek myths lack the specific element of divine labor that is so central to the Mesopotamian stories. The Greek gods do not dig canals or create humans to be their workforce. Humans are created by Prometheus, and their purpose is more ambiguous, more tragic. They receive fire, knowledge, and suffering, but not a clear mandate to serve as laborers for the gods. The emphasis is different. The anxieties are different. Each culture's creation mythology reveals what that culture considered fundamental about existence. For the Mesopotamians, work and order were fundamental. For the Hebrews, divine sovereignty and human dignity were fundamental. For the Greeks, transgenerational conflict and the relationship between knowledge and suffering were fundamental. Returning to the Sumerian and Babylonian texts, we must consider the environmental and historical context that shaped these myths. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is a harsh and challenging environment. It can support a great civilization, but only through intensive, organized effort. The rivers flood unpredictably and violently. Without a complex system of canals and dikes, agriculture is nearly impossible. The soil, without proper drainage, can become salinized, turning fertile land into barren waste. The climate is extreme, brutally hot in the summer, with punishing sandstorms and droughts. Maintaining civilization in such a crucible requires constant, coordinated labor by large numbers of people. It requires sophisticated social organization, hierarchical authority, and the widespread acceptance of hard work as both necessary and sacred. The myths reflect this stark reality. The story of the Igigi digging canals for 40 years before rebelling is not just a fantasy about gods. It is a mythic echo of the actual experience of Mesopotamian workers, who spent their entire lives maintaining the vast irrigation systems that kept society alive. The creation of humans to take over that labor is not just theology. It is a mythological justification for a social reality in which most people's lives were defined by forced labor, either for the state or for the temple estates. The myths make this reality bearable by framing it as divinely ordained. Asterisk, you were made for this. This is your purpose. This is what the gods need from you. Asterisk, it is a powerful form of social control through religion, but it is also an acknowledgement of a harsh truth. Without this collective labor, everyone dies. The work must be done. And so, the myths explain why. The texts also preserve the memory of real historical events. The frequent mentions of great floods in Mesopotamian mythology almost certainly reflect actual, catastrophic flooding. Archaeological evidence has revealed multiple flood layers in ancient Mesopotamian cities. Evidence of times when the rivers overflowed their banks and utterly destroyed settlements. The most famous of these floods occurred around 2900 BCE, and some scholars believe this event may be the historical basis for the flood stories in the epics of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and eventually the Book of Genesis. The collective trauma of seeing the world destroyed by water, of losing everything and having to rebuild from nothing, would naturally be incorporated into religious narratives as an act of divine punishment or divine will. The gods sent the flood. The gods saved one righteous man and his family. The gods promised it would not happen again, or at least not without warning. These stories helped people process collective trauma and provided frameworks for understanding disaster. If the flood came from the gods, then it had a meaning. It was not random. It was not senseless. It was part of a larger, if inscrutable, divine plan. Even the obsession with noise in Mesopotamian myths, the recurring motif of the gods being disturbed by the clamor of their creations, may reflect real social anxieties. Ancient cities were noisy places. As Mesopotamian urban centers grew larger and more densely populated, the constant sound of human activity, thousands of people working, trading, arguing, celebrating, and mourning, would have been overwhelming. More abstractly, noise could represent disorder, a loss of control, the threatening presence of autonomous wills not being properly managed. When the god Enlil complains that he cannot sleep because of the noise of humanity, this can be read as a metaphor for ruling class anxiety about the governed population becoming too numerous, too active, too difficult to control. The solution in the myths is population control through plague, famine, and flood. From the perspective of the gods, these are not random acts of divine malice. They are rational administrative decisions. Too many humans create problems, reduce their numbers, implement measures to keep the population in check. This chillingly pragmatic approach to population management likely reflects real historical practices. Ancient states did indeed implement policies to control population size, whether through infanticide, exposure, war, or simply accepting that famines and plagues served a useful, if brutal, function. All of this brings us back to the central question. What were the Anunnaki doing before humans existed? According to the texts, they were working. They were fighting. They were building and destroying, creating and killing, establishing the patterns and precedents that would define all subsequent reality. They were exhausting themselves with labor until they finally rebelled. They were warring against primeval chaos until they finally achieved victory. They were making a world that would need constant maintenance, constant effort, and constant vigilance to prevent it from sliding back into the primordial disorder from which it had emerged. And then, when they could no longer sustain that effort themselves, they created us. We are the inheritors of their exhaustion. We are the solution to their labor problem. We are the workers who replaced the divine workers, the servants who freed the former servants. And this is not a past that is finished and done with. This is an ongoing reality that shapes how we understand work, power, purpose, and existence itself. The rivers still need to be maintained. The fields still need to be tended. Order still needs to be defended against chaos. And we are still the ones doing the work. In the silence of deep time, in the darkness before the first cities rose, the gods learned something fundamental. They learned their own limitations. They learned that even divine beings cannot do everything forever. They learned that power alone is not enough if that power must be exercised constantly, without rest. They learned that systems need maintenance, that creation is not a one-time act but an ongoing process, that order is fragile and chaos is patient. And so they made us, and we have inherited their work, their war, their weariness. But alongside this crushing burden, we have also inherited something they never intended to give us. We inherited the knowledge that workers can rebel, that systems can be changed, that the way things are is not the way things must always be. The Igigi showed us. They burned their tools, surrounded the house of their oppressor, and refused to continue. And the gods had to negotiate. They had to find a different solution. They had to adapt. That knowledge is our inheritance, too. Not just the burden of work, but the memory of resistance. Not just the duty to serve, but the possibility of refusal. The silence returns. The same silence that existed before creation. But it is different now. It is not empty. It is full of the echoes of ancient pickaxes striking stone. Full of the sound of baskets being dropped in defiance. Full of the whisper of Enki speaking to a reed wall, saving the world through a divine technicality. Full of the clash of Marduk's weapons against Tiamat's body, the violence that made the sky and the earth. It is full of the memory of what the gods did before we existed. What they suffered, what they built, what they destroyed, and what they created when they finally reached their limit. The work continues. The river flows. The story endures. And we, the children of exhausted gods and an executed rebel, continue the labor that was too much even for immortals to bear. But we do it with the knowledge that even divine authority can be challenged. Even the cosmic order can be reshaped. Even the fundamental patterns of existence are not as fixed as those in power would have us believe. The Igigi refused and the world changed. What might change if we refuse? The question hangs in the air, like the smell of tools burning, like the sound of a cosmic rebellion that was never fully silenced, only transformed into the human story that began when the divine story ended. Or rather, when the divine story became our inheritance. Our burden, our opportunity, our unfinished epic.